The battlefield was a graveyard of twisted metal and burning wreckage as the crimson light of a dying sun bled across the shattered ground. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of fuel, the cries of the wounded fading into the distance. Like ghosts, Kira lay on her side against the cold earth, her wrists bound by steel cuffs that bit into her skin, her breathing shallow as every movement sent waves of pain through her broken armor. Her people had told her all her life that humans were ruthless killers, that they never took prisoners, that their blades were faster than mercy. And when she heard the crunch of boots on the gravel behind her, she knew the moment had come. She turned her head just enough to see the shadow stretching over her, a tall figure in dark combat armor, a human, the glint of his blade catching the fading light as he drew it. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She forced herself to meet his gaze. Cold, unreadable behind the visor, she braced for the strike, for the sharp final moment that would end her life. Yet instead of the bite of steel she heard the sharp crack of metal as the blade slid under her cuffs, and with one swift twist split them apart. The cuffs fell to the dirt with a dull thud. Kira blinked in disbelief, flexing her freed wrists. As he stepped back, his voice calm but firm as he told her to get up, she pushed herself up slowly, her body trembling from exhaustion and confusion. She had no reason to trust him, yet her legs obeyed. She followed him through the wreckage, stepping over bodies from both their armies, some still clutching weapons. She watched him pause beside a fallen soldier from her own side, kneeling to pull a shattered banner from beneath the corpse, and lay it gently across the chest. It made no sense. She wanted to ask why, but her voice caught in her throat. They moved in silence. The only sounds the hiss of distant fires and the low groan of collapsing metal. The human moved with purpose, as if he knew exactly where he was going, every step deliberate, his blade always in hand. They reached the edge of the battlefield where the ground fell away into a ravine, the last light of the sun catching on pools of oil that reflected the sky in dark ripples. He led her down a narrow path carved into the stone, his movements quick but measured. She stumbled more than once, her balance still unsteady. Each time he glanced back but said nothing. When they reached the bottom, the air grew cooler, the shadows deeper. She could see the faint shimmer of energy fields above them as ships passed overhead. She stopped finally, forcing herself to speak, asking why he had spared her when killing her would have been easier. He turned to face her, his eyes unreadable through the visor, and after a long pause he said only, "You'll see soon," then turned and kept walking. The words were simple, but they struck her harder than any blow. She followed him deeper into the ravine, the walls closing in until the path was barely wide enough for them to pass. In the growing darkness, the sound of their footsteps seemed louder, each echo bouncing off the stone like a warning. Kira's mind raced with possibilities, wondering if she had been saved only to be used, wondering if the stories she had heard of human cruelty were true, or if this man was something different. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and ozone, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the steady hum of something mechanical, the sound growing louder with every step. She kept her hand near the hilt of her dagger, even though she knew it would not be enough if he turned on her. Yet for reasons she could not explain, she did not run. And when the path finally curved to reveal the faint blue glow of an unknown destination ahead, she realized that whatever waited for her there would decide whether his blade had truly been meant to kill or to save. The path through the ravine twisted like the spine of some ancient beast, its jagged walls rising high above them and blocking out the last remnants of sunlight. The air grew cooler and heavier as they moved deeper. The human steps were steady and unhurried yet purposeful, as if every turn and every shadow was familiar to him. Kira followed at a cautious distance, her mind a storm of questions. She could not reconcile the image of the merciless human warrior she had been taught to fear with the man who had freed her from the cuffs instead of ending her life. The ground beneath her boots was littered with debris from the battle above, scorched fragments of armor and the shattered remains of weapons. She recognized some as belonging to her people, and others unmistakably human. Yet what caught her attention most was how he moved through it all without stepping carelessly on the fallen, as if each broken piece had weight beyond its size. When they reached a bend in the ravine, the distant hum she had heard earlier grew louder and more distinct. She realized it was the sound of a portable power unit. Her eyes narrowing as suspicion prickled at the back of her neck, they emerged into a wider clearing where the remains of an old outpost stood, its walls half collapsed and its surface scorched from long-forgotten skirmishes. In the center stood a station, battered but still functional, its small lights blinking in rhythm. The human approached it without hesitation, his gloved fingers moving across the panel as he activated a transmitter. Farah's first thought was that he was calling for his own reinforcements, and that she had been led here to be handed over. Her hand drifted toward the dagger at her hip, but she froze when she saw the frequency on the screen. It was one used only by her peoples. Fleet. She stepped forward, her voice sharp as she demanded to know why he was sending a signal to her commanders. He didn't look at her when he answered, his tone calm and even, saying only that they would come for her if they knew she lived. Her pulse quickened as she searched his face for some sign of deceit, but the visor hid too much. Before she could press him further, he stepped away from the station and motioned for her to stay quiet. She tilted her head listening, and then she heard it too, the faint crunch of movement above them on the ridge, shadows shifting against the dim light filtering in from the ravine's edge. The human moved quickly to the cover of a broken wall, pulling her down beside him. The sound of voices drifted down. Not human, and not from her people, mercenaries, the kind who hunted survivors after a battle to sell them for ransom or worse. Kyra's pulse pounded in her ears as she gripped her dagger tighter. The human's hand brushed her arm, not in comfort, but in warning. He leaned close enough for her to hear his whisper, telling her they were being tracked, and that if she wanted to live, she would need to trust him. She wanted to protest, to demand answers, but the sound of gravel skittering down the ravine wall told her the mercenaries were moving closer. The human glanced toward the station, then back at her, his meaning clear. The signal had been sent and they had to move. He led her toward a narrow gap in the wall that opened into a hidden trail along the ravine floor, his movements silent and precise, as if every step was calculated to leave no trace. She followed reluctantly, her mind wrestling with the growing realization that his mercy was not an accident, and that whatever his reasons were, they were tangled in something larger than either of them. When they finally reached a shadowed alcove tucked beneath an overhang, he stopped, turning to face her. In the dim light, she could just make out the faint glint of his eyes through the visor. He told her that the battlefield was only the beginning, and that the real danger was coming from those who did not wear either of their uniforms. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air around them. Her instincts screamed to run, but something in his voice kept her rooted in place, and as the sound of their hunters faded into the distance, she realized that every step she took with him was drawing her further into a story she did not yet understand. The night deepened as Kira followed Kale along the narrow trail cut into the ravine wall. The stars above were little more than thin silver threads through the jagged edges of stone. Every sound felt sharper in the darkness, the crunch of their boots on loose gravel, the faint rustle of unseen creatures in the shadows. the distant rumble of shifting rock somewhere deeper in the canyon. Kale moved with the steady rhythm of someone who knew the land well, his posture low, his head turning. Just enough to scan the ledges above. Kira kept her distance but never let him out of sight, her mind tangled with suspicion and curiosity. She could not forget the mercenaries' voices drifting down from the ridge, nor the fact that Kale had sent a signal on her people's frequency without hesitation. She wanted to believe it was a sign of alliance, but she had seen too many betrayals. Dressed as kindness, the path twisted sharply to the left, leading them into a cluster of rock spires that rose like ancient guardians against the night sky. Kale slowed his pace, crouching to move through a gap so narrow they had to turn sideways once through. The ground sloped downward into a basin filled with pale blue light. The source was a cluster of strange plants growing along the water's edge, their petals wide and luminous, casting a soft glow that danced across the cavern walls. The sight almost made Kira forget her exhaustion. She had heard stories of such flora from her people's explorers, plants that could survive in places untouched by the suns for centuries. Kale did not pause to admire them, his focus fixed on a low structure at the far end of the basin. It was half buried in stone and moss, its surface dented and weathered, a relic from a war far older than theirs. As they drew closer, she saw the faded insignia carved into the metal. Not human, not from her world, but from a third faction long thought extinct. Kale knelt beside the sealed hatch and brushed away the dust, his fingers moving over a small panel until a faint hum vibrated through the air. The door hissed open to reveal a narrow tunnel lined with old wiring and dim emergency lights. Kira hesitated at the threshold, her instincts warning her that stepping inside was a point of no return. Kale glanced back at her, his voice low as he told her that this place would hide them from the mercenaries and anyone else tracking them. She stepped in reluctantly, the air inside cool and tinged with the scent of rust. The tunnel curved downward, the walls widening into a larger chamber where a long-dead command station sat in eerie silence. Flickering screens still glowed faintly, and in the center stood a functioning comms array. Kyra's eyes narrowed as she realized this was no random hiding place. Kale had led her here deliberately. She asked him again why he was helping her, why he had risked his life to save someone who should have been his enemy. His answer came slowly, not as an explanation, but as a promise. He said the truth would make sense only when they left this canyon alive. Before she could press him further, the faint sound of static crackled through the comms. Kale moved quickly to the controls, his fingers dancing over the interface. Kira recognized the encryption. It was her people responding to the signal. Hope and fear collided in her chest. Kale told her they had to move before the mercenaries realized the source of the transmission. She followed him down a side passage branching off the chamber, its floor slick with moisture, the ceiling low enough that she had to keep her head bent. The deeper they went, the more the sound of water grew, until they emerged beside an underground river rushing through a jagged cut in the stone. Kale stepped onto a narrow ledge and motioned for her to follow, the roar of the water nearly drowning out his words. He told her this river was the hidden path that could carry them out of the canyon unseen. Kira stared into the dark current, knowing that stepping onto it meant surrendering herself to both the river and the man who had brought her here. Yet with the echo of the mercenaries' footsteps still lingering in her mind, she had no choice but to follow. The underground river surged with a cold, relentless force as Kira stepped onto the slick stone ledge behind Kale. The roar of the current filled the cavern like the growl of some ancient beast. Droplets clung to her armor as the icy spray rose in waves. Kale moved quickly, his boots gripping the narrow edge with practiced precision, his head turning just enough to scan the shadows ahead. The air here was damp and heavy, carrying the faint metallic tang of old blood. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of rocks splintering echoed down the passage, and Kira felt her gut tighten. She knew that sound was not the river, it was boots on stone, deliberate and fast. The mercenaries had found their trail. Kale did not speak, but the urgency in his movements was answer enough. The ledge narrowed until they were pressed close to the wall, jagged stones scraping against their arms as they pushed forward. A faint glow appeared ahead. Not the soft light of the plants from before, but the sharp white flicker of artificial lamps. Kale slowed, crouching as they approached an opening in the cavern wall. Beyond it, the river widened into a pool surrounded by a ring of jagged rocks. And on those rocks 3 figures waited, armored in mismatched plates and armed with long-barreled rifles, their helmets marked with the red slash of a contract kill order. Kira's breath caught in her throat. Mercenaries of the blood signal, known for hunting down survivors and selling their bodies to the highest bidder. Kale's hand closed around her wrist, pulling her back into the shadows as one of the mercenaries turned, scanning the darkness with a narrow beam of light. The beam swept over the wall above them and lingered for a moment before moving on. Kale's voice was barely a whisper, telling her to follow his lead. He moved along the wall until they reached a natural arch of stone that bridged over the river. The sound of the current masked their movements as they climbed, but halfway across, a loose rock tumbled from beneath Kira's boot and splashed into the water. The mercenaries reacted instantly, shouts echoing in the chamber as the nearest one opened fire, the sharp crack of energy rounds lighting the cavern in bursts of blue. Kale pushed Kira forward, urging her into a sprint across the arch, the stone shuddering under their weight. They hit the far side and dove behind a column of rock as another volley slammed into the wall above, shards of stone raining down around them. Kale drew his blade, the metal catching the light for just a heartbeat before he was gone. Moving with a speed that blurred his form, Kira heard the first mercenary cry out, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting stone. She peeked around the edge and saw Kale locked in a brutal struggle with the second, their weapons clashing. In quick, deadly arcs, the third mercenary raised his rifle toward Kale's exposed back, but Kira was already moving, launching herself across the rocks and driving her dagger into the joint of his shoulder plate. The weapon clattered from his hands as he fell back with a roar. Kale finished the second mercenary in a swift motion and turned to face the last. But the man was already stumbling toward the edge of the pool, clutching his wound. Kale grabbed Kira's arm, pulling her toward the far tunnel without looking back. The fight had cost them time, and the echoes of shouts deeper in the tunnels told her more were coming. They ran with the river at their side until the tunnel curved sharply, opening into a chamber where the ceiling rose high and the sound of the water became a distant murmur. Kale stopped listening, his head tilted toward the path behind them, his voice low as he told her they would have to take the next passage, one that would not be on any map. Kira felt the cold knot in her chest tighten, realizing that this was not just a hunt, it was a chase into places even the hunters feared to go, and that whatever lay ahead might be worse than those chasing them. The narrow passage Kale chose was nothing like the wider tunnels they had used before. The walls pressed in so close that Kira's shoulders brushed the cold, damp stone with every step. The air was heavy and stale, carrying the scent of minerals. And something older, something that had been sealed away for decades. The only light came from the dim glow of Kale's wrist lamp, casting long, shifting shadows ahead of them. Every sound was magnified here. The scuff of boots on grit, the faint, drip of water far ahead, and the low steady beat of her own pulse. They walked in silence for what felt like hours until the tunnel abruptly widened into a chamber with a ceiling lost in darkness. The walls here were smooth and etched with markings she didn't recognize, symbols half buried under centuries of dust. Cale paused at the center of the chamber, resting one hand against the wall, as if to steady himself. Kira watched him carefully, her patience finally snapping as she demanded to know why he was risking both their lives. Why he had spared her when his orders had surely been to kill. Her voice echoed back at her from the high walls, sharp and accusing. Cale's head lifted slowly, and his voice was quiet but steady as he said he had been ordered to execute any surviving enemy officers. He met her eyes and told her he had seen her on the battlefield shielding her wounded, even when it meant taking fire herself. In that moment he had known she was not the enemy they had been told to destroy. Kira frowned, struggling to believe. Him. He stepped closer, his words gaining weight as he said the war was built on lies. That both their worlds had been fed stories designed to keep them fighting, while those in power grew stronger. She felt her chest tighten with a mix of anger and disbelief. Before she could respond, the faint static of a cum unit crackled through the chamber. Kyle pulled a small device from his belt, adjusting the signal. Voices filtered through, distorted by interference but unmistakably urgent. They were not human voices, they were her people. She stepped forward, calling into the device, but Cale held it back. His tone firm as he said, revealing their exact position. Now would bring the mercenaries on them before her people could arrive. Instead, he proposed they move to a location only he knew. A place where the signal could be boosted without risk of interception. She hesitated, torn between mistrust and the cold logic of his plan. Before she could decide, a distant metallic clang echoed through the tunnel they had come from, followed by the low growl of voices. The mercenaries had found their trail again. Cale shut down the cum and motioned for her to follow. They moved quickly through a side tunnel barely wide enough to fit them. The ground sloped downward and the air grew cooler still until the walls glistened with a thin sheen of moisture. Ahead, the faint sound of rushing water grew louder. The tunnel opened onto a ledge overlooking an underground chasm where a black river surged far below. Cale led her along a narrow walkway carved into the stone, the drop to their left vanishing into shadow. Halfway across, he stopped, turning to face her, his voice low but carrying an edge of urgency as he told her again that she was more important, alive than she understood, that if she reached her people with the truth, it could change the course of the war. She stared at him, searching for any hint of deceit, and found none. The sound of footsteps behind them broke the moment. They turned to see the flicker of torchlight in the tunnel they had left. Cale's grip on her arm tightened as he pulled her forward. And with the roar of the river below and the hunters closing in above, Kira realized the truth was not just in his words, but in the way he had chosen to stand beside her even as the darkness closed in. The tunnel opened into the cold bite of night air as Kira and Cale emerged onto the narrow ridge. The wind tore at their clothes, carrying the scent of smoke and metal from the battlefield far behind them. The ridge stretched like a blade between two yawning chasms, its jagged stone lit only by the pale light of the twin moons. Far below, the valley shimmered with the faint blue glow of energy shields, and Kira's heart surged when she saw the silhouettes of her people's extraction ships waiting, yet the path to them was not open. Between the ridge and the descent into the valley stood a squad of heavily armed assassins, their armor blackened and marked with the red insignia of the blood signal. Their weapons were already raised. Cale slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the ground for cover. There was none. The ridge was too narrow for stealth and too exposed for retreat. The assassins moved forward in formation, their boots striking the stone in perfect rhythm. Kale's voice was calm but sharp as he told Kira that he would hold them while she ran for the ships. She shook her head, refusing before the words could even leave his mouth. They stood side by side, their weapons drawn, as the assassins broke into a run. The first volley of fire cut the air with a hiss. Kale deflected a shot with the flat of his blade, while Kira ducked low and drove forward, her dagger finding the gap between the plates of the nearest assassin's armor. He fell with a choked cry, and she used his body as a shield against the next burst. Kale moved like a storm, every strike of his blade deliberate and unyielding, his movements forcing the assassins into each other's paths. Yet their numbers pressed hard. A boot caught Kira in the side, sending her staggering to the edge of the ridge, where loose stones tumbled into the chasm below. She caught herself and spun back into the fight, the clash of steel and the crack of rifles filling the night. One assassin lunged for Kale's unprotected back, but Kira intercepted, slamming her shoulder into him and knocking his rifle into the abyss. The squad leader barked an order, and the remaining assassins tightened their circle. Kale and Kira stood back to back, the heat of his presence steadying her breath as they fought with every ounce of strength left. A flash of light split the sky above, and the roar of engines thundered over the ridge as her people's gunships swooped in. The sudden wind from their descent scattered dust and forced the assassins to brace themselves. Kale used the moment to strike, his blade flashing through the air and dropping the last attacker to the ground. Kyra's chest heaved as she looked toward the ships now landing at the far end of the ridge. Her people were waving for her to run. Kale stepped back, his shoulders lifting in a silent sigh of relief, but his eyes held something heavier. He told her to go without him, his tone firm in a way that brooked no argument. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before turning and running toward the ships, the sound of boots and voices growing louder behind her as more of her soldiers rushed forward to secure the ridge. When she looked back, Kale was already moving toward the opposite end, disappearing into the shadows that clung to the rocks. The image of him alone against the backdrop of the moons burned into her mind. The wind carried the scent of ozone from the gunships and the faint echo of the battle that had just ended. But beneath it all, Kira felt the unshakable truth that their fight was far from over, and that somewhere beyond the valley's edge, Kale was already preparing for whatever storm would come next. The ramp of the extraction ship vibrated beneath Kyra's boots as she climbed aboard, the harsh glow of the interior lights casting sharp lines across her armor. The medics moved toward her, but she waved them off, her eyes locked on the ridge. Beyond the open hatch, the moon still hung above the jagged stone where Kale had stood only moments ago. The wind tore at the shadows, and for a fleeting heartbeat, she thought she saw him there. But the ridge was empty save for the drifting mist. The ship's engines rumbled to life, and the valley below began to fall away as they lifted into the night. One of her captains approached, asking how she had survived. The question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. Kyra hesitated, the truth pressing against her tongue. She thought of the first moment she had seen him on the battlefield. The gleam of his blade in the dying light, the certainty that it would end her. And how instead she had felt the sudden weight of broken cuffs falling from her wrists. She thought of the long road through the ravine, the mercenaries' hunt, the cold rush of the underground river, the battles fought shoulder to shoulder. In places where death had been certain, she looked at her captain and simply said that an ally had found her, nothing more. As the ship climbed higher, the comms officer reported that the War Council demanded her immediate presence. They wanted a full report on the battle and the enemy movements. But Kara knew the council would not believe the truth, even if she spoke it. Kale's words echoed in her mind about the war being built on lies, about power feeding on the hatred between their worlds. She moved to the viewport, watching the landscape blur beneath them. Her thoughts heavy yet clear. She would carry his message, but not here in the open where it could be twisted. She would wait for the right moment, one where the truth could not be buried. The ship shuddered as it broke through a pocket of turbulence, and she braced herself against the frame, the cold metal under her hand reminding her of the moment on the ridge when Kale had touched her shoulder instead of striking her down. It had been a simple touch, no words, yet it had carried the weight of trust, a silent promise that her life mattered beyond the lines drawn by war. She knew then that he had chosen to stay behind, not because he could not escape, but because his fight was not finished. Somewhere in the vast darkness beyond the valley, he was still moving, still working to unravel the threads of the war that bound them both. And she felt the strange certainty that their paths would cross. Again, the ship leveled out as they approached the capital, the distant glow of its towers rising against the horizon. Her captain turned to speak, but stopped at the sight of her expression, a mix of determination and something harder to name. She adjusted the strap of her armor and straightened, stepping into the command deck as the city lights filled the forward windows. The War Council would hear her version of the events, stripped of the details that would endanger him, but the truth, the real truth, would remain hers to guard until the time was right. The engine's hum became a steady rhythm beneath her feet, and as the ship descended, she carried with her the memory of that first moment, when she had braced for the human's blade and found instead a touch that had changed everything. If you love thrilling HFY Sci-Fi stories like this, turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next twist in our sci-fi universe. Make sure to hit that subscribe button.